Not sure about you, but I ate lunch very quickly. But I'm a teacher, so I am an expert at eating lunch very quickly. We all know what that's like. Before we get into our next session, I do want to just take a moment to say a special thank you to Mariana Garcia for running the tech behind the scenes. She is controlling the spotlight, and she is monitoring the chat, and she picked the music, and has just really kind of pulled this together to be a very professional operation today. So again, thank you to Mariana for all of those efforts. Actually, thank you very much to the Connecticut Democracy Center for partnering with us on this program, where we're bringing the leaders of social studies together. When I think about leadership, I definitely think about the Connecticut Democracy Center in so many different ways, especially the public programs, the local programs that they do, the statewide programs like Connecticut History Day and Connecticut Kid Governor, and also the national impact that they're starting to have with the variety of programs. Just really a wonderful, wonderful organization. So again, thank you to Mariana. Thank you to Connecticut Democracy Center folks for partnering with us. Next person I'm gonna bring up, actually, I think most of us know this person. I would consider him the godfather of social studies, but in a nice way, not like, you know, I have an offer you can't refuse. Although sometimes I do feel like there are offers that
you don't want to accept.
Exactly, you got it. All right, so anyway, Steve is educator. Started out in Manchester, came up through West Hartford, where he was the social studies department chair. Has been a leader in the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies since I think the 80s. I'm sorry to date you like that. And now currently is the social studies consultant for the State Department of Education. So I'm going to turn over to Steve Armstrong. Steve?
Thank you very much. And I would like to, continuing Tony's accolades for the Connecticut Democracy Center, the next part of our day is we're going to call upon Sally Whipple, who is the executive director of the Connecticut Democracy Center, and the winner, recent winner of the Bruce Fraser Friend of Social Studies Award from Connecticut Council, which is awarded to someone a non-teacher, who really helps social studies education in the state. And as Tony has said, the things that Sally has done, the workshops she's put together, the time she's put in on civic education couldn't be counted. So we're going to have as this year's Fraser Award winner, Sally Whipple from the Connecticut Democracy Center.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Tony. I was really pleased to get this award from the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. But I will say that this award is not at all for me. It's for the colleagues I work with. It's for Rebecca Tabor and Nicole Souza, who run History Day. It's for Brian Cofrancesco and Jacob Orcutt, who run Connecticut's Kid Governor. It's for Mariana, who a few months ago hadn't even heard of Zoom and now is running all kinds of conferences and doing great tech work. We have a wonderful team where I am, and I think that anything that has happened at Connecticut's Democracy Center at the Old State House to earn this award has been achieved through my colleagues, and there are more of them as well. But I thought that Steve had asked me if I could say something about museums and educators working together, and that's kind of an interesting topic to me. I don't think there's an answer to it. I'll tell you that right off the bat. There's no one set of things that educators, teachers in classrooms, and museums can do to work together other than build relationships and get to know one another, get to understand what museums need to understand what teachers really need. Teachers should be able to understand what museums really have. There are a lot of barriers, as you know, to museums and classroom teachers and students working together. There's always the question of transportation, which I imagine is much more complicated now after We've opened up after the pandemic has run through part of its course. There are scheduling problems. There's timing problems. How can you take students out to a museum when you don't really know what the experience is going to be, when you need that valuable time in the class with them? And on the museum side, it is, we are always driven to get more and more students into our museums. That's something our boards want to see. But the board doesn't always understand the resources that we need to have in order to serve those students as best we can. So I think that, another barrier is that classroom teachers and museum staff members are all overworked. We all have too much to do, and it's very hard to find the time to figure out just the right way to work with one another. But there are so many wonderful success stories of museums and educators working together throughout Connecticut. So many museums with wonderful resources. And there was one person who really was interested in bringing museums and educators together, and that happened to be Bruce Fraser. And I don't know if any of you happen to know him, but Bruce was a longtime director of Connecticut Humanities. He really is the one who set its course for the future. And I thought, well, maybe I could give you a little historical context, since that seems to be very important, about some of the things that exist today that Bruce set in motion. First of all, when I first became a museum educator after I got out of graduate school, there was something that was going on in Connecticut called the Rockefeller Grant, which was a grant that put a lot of money into helping museums gather together primary documents and work with teachers to think about how they could use those in the classroom. And that was a really valuable project. I didn't really know why I was involved in that project, but it was really good for me because I got to meet a lot of teachers and I got to see how they would like to use primary documents in the classroom at that time. And I think that that was important because I think it reminds teachers that museums are the places where we have the authentic stuff. We have the documents, we have the artifacts, and all of those are tools for learning. And if we can find the ways to work together to get you the materials you need to show you how we use them so that can inform how you use them in the classroom, that's a really valuable gift. Bruce was also concerned with museum capacity. We would hear from teachers, well, we would love to take our kids to the local historical society, but they don't want us there. And I know I would think that's ridiculous, but I would talk to a small historical society and they would say, we don't want kids in our building. So it was kind of true. Or they did want kids in their building, but they didn't really know how their volunteers could work with the kids. So Bruce was really there at the beginning of supporting the Connecticut League of History Organizations and helping that organization build capacity through the STEPS program and other programs that help museums prepare themselves to help teachers and help students and help the public. Connecticut Humanities also today has ConnecticutHistory.org and Teach It, which are online resources, which I hope everybody's using. ConnecticutHistory.org is invaluable as an online resource about Connecticut history, as is Teach It. And I have to say, those started out years ago, like when there was barely an internet, and Bruce had this idea about this encyclopedia of Connecticut history, which was not well formed because the internet wasn't really well formed at that time. And everybody just, I think a lot of people kind of thought, oh, that's a great idea, Bruce. Sure, go ahead, do that. But then one day it just clicked and it became ConnecticutHistory.org. And now this vision that Bruce had a long time ago is a really wonderful tool that brings history museums and teachers together through really great shared, reliable information. And so I think that looking through Teach It is a good way to find museums that are doing things for teachers, but even looking at ConnecticutHistory.org is a great way to unearth local stories that you can then go to your museum, your local historical society, and ask about, see if they have primary documents related to that story, and work with them to sort of unearth some things that might be really good for your students. The other thing that Bruce did, and this is funny kind of to have the Bruce Fraser Friend of Social Studies Award, because for a short time, Bruce and I were really not friends. We had some disagreements about how some things could be done, but we came to an agreement. And one of the things that he developed was a way for nonprofits and some museums, for the Connecticut League of History Organizations, to get significant funding without having to break their backs writing 1 million grants a year. And those were called partnerships. So the league has a partnership that helps them to serve you better. They get help from Connecticut Humanities for that. Connecticut History Day was one of the first partnerships that we had. Bruce and Lori Rayner put that in motion so that Connecticut History Day had the funding that it needed for the first time ever to move ahead, so that resources could be focused on making the program better and serving teachers more effectively rather than constantly looking for money. And it was the money that he invested in History Day that really gave us the know-how to run a statewide program and the courage to start Connecticut's Kid Governor. So I owe a lot of these things to the vision of Bruce Fraser. And I think that that these pieces are now in place, and I hope we can get more pieces in place in the future to help museums, smaller museums, be more prepared to work with you and give you what you need. But I also would say that just for working with museums, I know a lot of you do already, but we always think over and over, just tell us what you need and we will do our best to supply what you need. Because even though we are all of us overworked, we are charged with serving you. We are educational institutions first and foremost, and it is our job to help you work with students in Connecticut and help them understand history. So I don't think that gives any answers, and Steve will probably yell at me after this for not giving any good answers to this question about how do museums and educators work together. But that's what I have to say, and I am really happy to be here today, and I really thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Sally. At this time, we're going to get into a little bit more information about the standards project and how we're going to be moving from, or actually creating standards based off the framework. So I'm going to actually kick it back over to Steve. Steve's going to give you a little bit more top level information, then I'm going to follow up with a little bit more details.
Perfect.
Go ahead, Steve.
And if Tony, with your permission, I'm going to just very briefly mention 2 other topics as well first.
Okay. Oh, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, just so everyone, I'm sure everybody knows this, but the African American, Black, Latino, Puerto Rican Studies course, that every high school must be offering this course next year. There's about 50 schools piloting this year, and next year, their CERC will be running professional development for this over the summer and into the fall. So that's a course that every district must run at the high school level. And in the discussion part, if there's questions about that, or if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to address those. Another thing that you may not have heard of is that beginning in the fall of 2023, every district, this was legislated last spring, every district in your social studies curriculum must teach Indigenous history, must teach somewhere in your curriculum. And this is, by the way, for those that know the Holocaust legislation, it's virtually a carbon copy of that. It doesn't tell you where you have to teach it. There's no indication of how much you have to teach it. But there you must be teaching Indigenous peoples, and there's a group that's going to be working on that very enthusiastically will be creating new curriculum materials for you. But the real reason that we're here, one of the reasons we're here today, is I hope everybody here knows there are Connecticut social studies frameworks, which there's a number of people on this call that work diligently on those frameworks. And we're proud of the frameworks. People around the country, I know this, have used our framework as a model when they were doing their frameworks. But the thing is, in our department, we have frameworks and the other academic disciplines have standards. So what we've been encouraged to do is create move from a frameworks document to a standards document. And what that would mean, and I think there's also some K-5 folks that have asked for this. because I think as they do curriculum, they look, some of them, not all of them, but some of them would look for more guidance. So for those reasons, so I think what a standards document would be, it allows us the chance to look at it again. Because remember, this was created back in 2014, 2015. It gives us a chance to look at it again. I know there's some people that said we should look at grade 4. Well, you know what? We'll look at the whole thing and see if we want to make revisions. But I think more importantly, we're just going to be giving some more, we're going to just be, there'll be some more content specifications, specificity on content in this new document. So that's the plan that will be taking place this year. And as always, Connecticut State Department of Education will be a partner in this and will be active in this. And also we're going to be partnering with the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies on this. So Tony, why don't you give some more specifics on how the procedure is going to run?
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I do have some specifics. The best way for me to do this, sorry, I have like a notification on my screen. All right, the best way for me to do this is going to be to share my screen. So let me go ahead and do that. This document here that I'm about to show you, I don't want to say it's secret, but it is definitely still kind of in draft form. This is the Standards Partnership timeline. We're actually working on, Connecticut Council for Social Studies is working on a couple areas of partnership, but I'm going to focus mostly on the standards partnership. So right now, we are in the very early stages. We are assembling a team and defining the purpose. We have assembled a steering committee. So we haven't even had our first meeting yet. So y'all are in on the very, very early phase of the information on this. And we've also convened a group of project associates, I guess you could call them, researchers that are looking at standards from across the nation to evaluate what's working in their documents and kind of comparing them to the Connecticut document so we can see, number one, what do we really like about Connecticut's frameworks and what do we want to keep? And then as we move towards standards, what are the different things that we should be adding in? So we're working on putting together a position, a project manager position, someone that's going to be helping with the organization. Like I just said, convening the steering committee, establishing the standard project associate team. And very soon we will have a survey instrument going out. Or we're going to be creating a survey instrument and also a focus group protocol, but we will be surveying educators to get some initial information. Then the next step is really having to do with assessing the needs. We're going to administer that stakeholder survey like I was telling you about, and then we're going to assemble a stakeholder feedback report. You'll notice that our first major deadline is December 30th, which is very soon. It's only 2 months away, 60 days away. I hope that lets you know how quickly we'll be moving through this process. Immediately after that, or maybe even concurrently, we'll begin drafting the standards. We're going to have some working groups. I think the way that we're going to organize it is different grade level groups, and at the high school level, different subject area groups will be developing the standards. And then we have to have our first draft to the State Department of Education by March 15th. My birthday is March 17th, so that'll be a little birthday present to me that we made it over that hurdle. I'm not sure why anybody cares that it's my birthday or not, but I wanted to let you know. Also, we're going to be moving into public comments beginning March 31. It's going to be online stakeholder comments or feedback where we're going to be taking feedback from parents and students and educators and all the folks that you could consider a stakeholder would be contributing to that. We're going to revise and submit. The working groups will conclude during this process. We're going to submit the standards for final draft by May 9th. And then we're going to submit the standards to the Connecticut State Department of Ed for review and final approval by June 1. And then our final report is due to the State Department of Ed by June 23. In addition to that, so it's almost going to be concurrently, right? So we're going to have a good idea of what these standards are going to look like. And then at the same time, we're going to be beginning our rollout. We have to have 10 professional development workshops, actually significant length professional development workshops by June 23rd, which is the same time that we're having our final report due. We're going to hopefully launch a community partnership grant that's going to bring museums and schools together to create curriculum and sustainable partnerships, including transportation, to get schools into museums. We are going to kick off the Social Studies K-8 model curriculum project, which is technically due January 2023. And then we'll be rolling this out certainly this next year, but probably for several years at Connecticut Council for Social Studies, PDs, and conferences. So again, it's a very ambitious schedule. I think that the time that we find ourselves in warrants this quick schedule, and it's going to be with the help of the leaders, right? Social studies leaders. That's why we assembled you all today to help us kind of get over the line. Steve, could you maybe give a little idea as I'll stop my share here? Actually, that's kind of a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions at this point? That's kind of a lot of information that we just kind of put out. Any questions from folks?
Could you note, if you haven't already, and if you're interested in being involved, I put the intern at the State Department of Ed's email. So if you have interest in being involved in this process, email her. She's coordinating the steering committee and things of that nature. Could I reiterate before, if anyone has questions, but first, I can't tell you enough how I would support Tony. I think for a lot of reasons, this is the right time to do this. I think with what's going on with social studies in some communities being quote unquote under attack, I think it's a good statement to make right now that this year we're fundamentally looking at what teachers and kids are doing in social studies classes and looking to sort of see how we could help that process in any way. So I think, I hate to say the word politically, but I think both politically and educationally, this is a good time of the year. This is a good spot to be doing this.
Steve, I think we said that we were going to have a little bit of a focus group time.
Yeah, can I just talk briefly about the K-8?
Please.
Yeah, the K-8 piece, if you haven't heard this, the K-8 piece is another bit of legislation that came down the pike. By the way, you realize when we're talking about standards, and you realize in a state like Connecticut without social studies testing, you use the standards as you find appropriate in your district, right? We're a local control state. You use the standards as you think. There was also legislation passed at the last legislative session that requires a K-8 social studies model curriculum to be created for all of the disciplines: language arts, math, social studies, science. We can't do that until the standards work is done, because a curriculum is based on standards. So after the standards are done, the next piece of the process is to create this model curriculum document. And not to get too much into the weeds here, but there's also legislation, and this will be very interesting to work on this. And we've got people from all of these groups actively involved, that there'll be reference there to Indigenous people. There'll be reference to Asian Pacific Americans. There'll be representation to the LGBT community. There'll be a beefing up of civics. There'll be a discussion of veterans. So this is going to be a very interesting curriculum. But again, I think the time is right. And if you, or if there's somebody in your school that you think would want to be involved in this process in some way, even in just when we're down the pike and we're asking for reviewers or writers, it doesn't have to be a big role. Just have them email that Tammy and let them know what they want to do and what their level of involvement is.
So again, I think we'd like to open this up just a little bit to the participants here. Maybe if anyone has any initial thoughts or questions that they'd like to offer about what we presented here.
I just wanted to share that I think a document like this, whether it's the revised standards, whether it is the K-8 curriculum, is going to be so appreciated by so many teachers. And I know from a leadership perspective, I appreciate that as well. It gives me a little more ground to stand on when I'm justifying why we might be teaching certain content, or as I'm working with 8 different elementary schools to make sure that I'm ensuring a common experience or common opportunities, regardless of what teacher a child has. And, you know, so I think it is a really exciting time. I think it's a great step for us to be taking. My teacher, who is doing the African-American Latino course, has, you know, raved about that sample curriculum that CERC produced, just because there are so many tricky conversations. And he said to me in an email today, after I shared resources from yesterday's presentations, he said, you know what, I'm feeling really confident with how things are going, and I'm feeling really good about the suggestions that are in that curriculum. And I was like, wow, do you know how different that is from 2 months ago when we started? You know, so I think having these documents is going to be truly beneficial to everybody.
Thank you for that.
Mary Hannah, can I ask you from an elementary perspective, what's your thoughts on this, the need or the desire for this type of thing?
Yeah, no, I do agree with it. It gives us some teeth to, you know, it gives us sort of an anchor to have those conversations in our district. We have an assured curriculum right now, but I think as time gets eroded, this will go back to, well, we've got standards. We can't diminish the time anymore. We need to have this amount of time to accomplish this work. So I think it allows, at a local level, it's very helpful to go to standards, especially with teachers dealing with standards in every other subject, K-5. I think that'll be very helpful. I don't know if that really answers it. There's
No,
a
it
lot.
does. Thank you.
That's great.
It's a good time to go back to revisit those frameworks anyway, to see what they really mean, and do they mean the same thing we wanted them to mean in 2014.
Right.
Great point. I see Karen with a hand. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, everyone. One thing I think is really important, and something I'm hoping will be an outcome from this work, is that we'll be a little bit closer to striking the right balance between flexibility and some more concrete directive. I feel like as someone who teaches in a district that has a lot of challenges and a lot of transients, we would definitely benefit more from there being more direction. I think a lot of our wealthier districts seem to benefit more from the flexibilities. But those of us who teach populations where, you know, we have a lot of students in and out every year from other districts, it does become a lot more challenging. And I think that the standards are going to help us strike a better balance there. That's what I'm hoping for in terms of closing achievement gaps. And, you know, we have a lot of disparities in our state. I think we have to keep that mindful. We have to be mindful of that as we pursue this work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Any other initial thoughts or questions? See something in the chat here. Hold on, I think it was Sally. Sally had said, I think standards will make it easier for museums to know what teachers need and provide meaningful, useful, and timely resources and experiences. I agree with that. I do want to go back to what Karen was just saying just a second ago about the balance between suggesting content and local control. How do you think we should approach that as we're going forward? Like what suggestions do you as leaders have in order to help us kind of thread that needle?
Our district believes wholeheartedly in local control. So I think when you come to sort of American studies and, certain things about knowing about the government, there's going to be some grade levels where this is going to be a lot easier digested than others. It's a difficult balance though, but I heard you say, Tony, or Steve, we were going to have some focus groups with parents as well. So I think that, just making sure that we're transparent, there's no hidden agenda here, will be super helpful. But I think we've had to reiterate that there's local control, that we do have local control, that we are trying to meet the needs of our students. But as Karen said, we are seeing more movement from town to town. It may not be major transients, but there is transients. So how do we sort of align across the state at the same time with, if we're inquiry based and we're inquiring into our own town and state, that sort of lends itself for some local control, because students are really defining some of that local control and the issues that mean really a lot to them. So I think inquiry is a piece of what sort of helps us here.
Excellent. Laura?
I'm also thinking.
Then we'll do Eileen after that. Eileen, you're next, okay?
I also think that if it's a standard, if the focus is more on the standards, then it may actually be easier for some funding from some districts. I know a lot of funding is tied to literacy, and oftentimes social studies gets the short stick for resources. I know for our district, a lot of the social studies teachers are basically depending on, free materials that are publicly available, and there's no funding for any materials in the classroom. So if it is a standards base, then a case can be made that it is supporting the ELA or the literacy curriculum. And I think that may help some districts with funding.
I went all day without being on mute when I tried to talk. Sorry about that, folks. Eileen had a point to make. Go ahead, Eileen.
Yeah, I was just thinking that there's really several challenges. One is the politics. I mean, it's an ideal time to write standards because there's so many great things out there that you can pull from. And I mean, it's just such a really rich time, but at the same time, it's such a political time. I mean, we're just trying to get through our local election without anything exploding around here. So that's just one comment. So after the local elections, we'll also have a better idea of what's going on in the towns across Connecticut. So that's important. And two, I think it's, if you really want buy-in at the teacher level, I think we have to tap into what districts have already created. I mean, there's been a void for a really long time. So a lot of districts have gone and created their own curriculums, K-8 or whatever we're looking at. So we really should tap into as much of what's out there as possible so that we can build on, we're not reinventing the wheel. And there might be more buy-in. And my last comment was at the district level and back to the politics and, we're at the superintendent level. I think the next logical question is, even though we have local control, and I'm in a very local control focused district, for better or for worse, I think there's going to be questions about tying this to an assessment. And that's always, which comes first. If they eventually wanted to, people are going to think that this is because down the road there would be a social studies assessment. And I be careful what we wish for. We want to be taken seriously, but does that mean we want to be assessed at that level? So there's just a lot, I guess there's a lot to think about short-term and long-term. And when I look at your timeline, it's like, oh my God, how are we going to do that? So yeah. All right.
It is a very fast
challenging timeline. Who are you? Is the state, Steve, is the state in charge of are you the project manager?
It's jointly controlled from Connecticut Department of Ed and two groups working, am I right, Tony? Is that a good way to phrase it? Working
would say
closely
that's the
together.
best way.
So you and
Yeah.
Tony are the project manager.
I can't
Well, we're kind
speak
of
for
like,
the,
Oh,
yeah, I mean, definitely, we are overseeing the project for sure, but we
Great.
are going to, like I was saying, hire someone that's going to be kind of managing the more day to day. I mean, I'm a classroom teacher, so, you know, it's really hard for me to organize materials, let's say, for every meeting. You can understand, I'm sure. You know, and before I get to Lauren, just really quickly, I wanted to comment on what you were saying, Eileen, about a potential test. You know, I think there's a lot of debate, like you touched on, about how whether or not we should be tested subjects. When we had a meeting with the previous commissioner of education, back when we were first proposing that we do a K-5 model curriculum just for social studies, the commissioner was saying that there is no appetite for another assessment at the state level, no appetite. I don't think that has changed. I can't imagine that has changed. So I think honestly, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to figure out how is it that we can provide more guidance for, like we're saying, especially for K-5. You know, we know that they love students, they love students learning, but they're not necessarily content experts. So I think that providing, and this even, from the conversations I've had, this even goes up into K-8. Not everyone that's teaching social studies is necessarily a content expert. So we want to provide a little bit more guidance. But back to Karen's point, and I guess your point as well about this local control, we don't want to overstep. You know, some folks have saying, oh, we really love the curriculum that was put out by the, you know, the Black and Latino studies, but other folks are saying it's a little bit too prescriptive. You know, so I think we're seeing both sides of this. And, you know, I think our role in creating these standards is trying to figure out how is it, again, we can walk that line in terms of providing enough guidance so people know what to teach, but not necessarily getting into the day-to-day classes.
where's the
Okay.
sweet spot? Where's the
Yeah.
sweet spot?
we're a crazy state. So
Yeah.
you're right, exactly right. It's finding that balance between acceptance and prescription. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're going for. Let's kick it over to Lauren. Though.
Could
Go,
I
Lauren.
just say one thing? I apologize who I'm interrupting. My apologies. The only possibility in the near future of a test is I know there's a couple of legislators who are going to, in this next session, propose a statewide requirement that all kids take the naturalization test to graduate. I don't think that would pass, but if that's the closest of any rumbling to a social studies test. And I'm not sure that that would win over. I don't think it would pass.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I wouldn't mind seeing the Naturalization Act test for running for office. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that one of the things that, you know, listening to everybody talk in this session is thinking about within that plan somewhere to have some communication with superintendents and engage superintendents in the conversation about social studies, because I don't think that the local control piece and the curriculum development piece is always going to be there. But I think that often social studies is not necessarily top of mind for superintendents with all of the different moving pieces that they have in their work. And so finding a space, I don't know where that is, you know, Tony and Steve, you have much more expertise in how to go about doing that, but really finding a venue or multiple ways to reach out and engage superintendents in the conversation and help them to understand the work that's being done in classrooms and the complexity of the work that's being done in social studies through the development of frameworks and things at the classroom level so that they can support the work and support teachers in their districts. So just something to kind of put out there as something to think about as we move through this process. How are superintendents going to be informed throughout the process and even to some extent trained or professionally developed to understand what the frameworks are going to look like and the work of social studies educators in their schools?
Lauren, just out of curiosity, would you guess that superintendents would view this as a positive?
I certainly think that just speaking from my own experiences, that superintendents really appreciate having the support of social studies leaders and educators to be able to help them understand the dynamics of, what's happening in the community and responses to curriculum. I don't think that that's going to go away anytime soon. So if there's any time to engage superintendents in a conversation about the social studies and perceptions about what's happening in social studies, now's probably the time as well. It's a good time to look at the frameworks, but it's probably a good time to engage superintendents in conversations so that they can really think through some of these pieces. We know what's happening at local level with Board of Education meetings and things like that. We've talked about the attack on history education all morning, and it's very real for them. And not every superintendent is a trained social studies educator. Not every superintendent fully understands the work that happens in social studies classrooms. They can't be expected to. So this might be an opportunity to educate and support our superintendents during a really complex and challenging time for them on a number of levels.
I'm loving what Mary had to say in the chat here about maybe a forum for principals, especially at the K-5 level, to help understand what instruction looks like. I think sometimes as a social studies teacher, I forget how removed our administrators could be, or maybe from what social studies instruction really is. I mean, the literacy skills that are involved, the critical thinking skills that are involved, the speaking and listening skills that are involved. I mean, really, in my mind, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, excuse me. Really, all the skills that you need for 21st century education that everyone says that we need are right here in the hub of social studies. Karen makes a great point about Connecticut Council for the Social Studies with a public relations committee. We're discussing this very strategy about how is it that we can get a little bit more on our front foot as opposed to being in a defensive position in terms of promoting what the social studies really is all about. I think at this time it's super, super critical, and it's going to be critical that we have leaders such as yourself helping us make that happen. I'm not saying that I'm not advocating that you go to your local school board and say how important social studies is, even though that probably would be a good idea. I'm not advocating that as the president of Connecticut Council for Social Studies, because that would not be good. But what I am saying is that I think we can promote within our own networks how important this is for sure, which wouldn't be a legislative thing. It would be more of a community relations thing, because we're all in this kind of together. I have another question about the information from today. We had 3 really amazing presentations this morning. One about National History Day, another one from the National Humanities Center, and the last one about the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. I'm wondering, how do we feel, or how do we think this type of information can inform the work that we're going to do in terms of the standards revisions or the standards writing?
Hey, Tony, I believe it gives more resources towards looking towards, again, for the frameworks and in creating the standards from those different organizations, for what was shared. And the way maybe that would be, again, a solid approach to how maybe through inquiry and such, and the different types of topics that social studies could be taught.
Thank you for that. Mary says in the chat, I don't think the teachers always understand how much of a firewall that administrators provide to allow them to do their work, and having standards will give them an anchor, say, hey, this is why we're teaching this, because it's in the standards. And I think that is going to be critical as we move forward.
And could I just remind everybody, anybody that worked back on the original frameworks back in 2014, 2015, remember, we intentionally kept a lot of content out of that as a specific goal. If anybody worked on that, you may remember that we very, very consciously said, we want this to be more of a guide than a, so that was good for the time, but this is good for this time, I think.
I think it's important to think, oh, go ahead, Steve.
And I guess the question is, Tony, that you're asking is, do you think, I mean, some of you heard it for the first time, but would the roadmap be of any help to us, does anyone think, as we proceed? Is that from even if you just heard it from the first time, would it be a guide that could help us as we move forward?
I think so, Steve. We started looking at some of our curriculum for revisions this past year. And I remember starting to outline civics and then randomly came across that roadmap and had a moment, of panic of, oh my gosh, I have to somehow tie this in first. And then I dug deeper, found out it was just a great example. But as I dug deeper, I thought this could be a really nice outline, especially for a secondary course on civics. There's a lot, though. That's definitely where we would need that committee to spend some time digging through the different grade level maps to see what's manageable and at which grade level.
Right. And if you look at Brian's question in the chat, how much should we prepare teachers for an overhaul? Tony, you can take this, but you follow me up here and help me out here. But my answer to that is I don't think that the frameworks, the basic framework is going to change that much. So if you're doing, say, for the sake of argument, curriculum overhaul this year, I think you'd be safe to keep working off of the frameworks. I think that the standards will simply give you another level of specification when they're completed. Tony, I don't know what you would say.
I think our position at this point anyway, even though we haven't gotten much feedback in terms of stakeholders, is that really what we're going to do is we're going to leave much of the frameworks intact. Dimension 1 has to do with the asking questions, supporting and compelling questions. Dimension 3 is working with sources and developing evidence so you can create your claims. And then 4 really has to do with communication and taking action. What we're going to be looking at is Dimension 2. Of course, it's the biggest dimension where you have all of your disciplinary concepts. That's where we're going to be diving into and saying, okay, how is it that we can add a little bit more guidance in terms of what can be taught? I mean, I think one thing that we're reacting to a little bit, even though I prefer to be proactive more than I do reactive, but we are reacting a little bit to a review from the Fordham Institute, which basically said that we had mediocre standards in the state of Connecticut. And the main reason they said we had mediocre standards is because there was no content on these standards. I'm not going to comment on whether or not the Fordham Institute is what we should be living and dying by, but I will comment that I want to have almost the gold standard for standards across the across the United States. So what we're going to do again is looking more closely at that Dimension 2, figuring out how is it that we can add content without being too prescriptive. Again, that's that balancing act that we're going to have to do. But one thing that they commented on is that nowhere in our standards document does it say Abraham Lincoln. All right, we can put Abraham Lincoln in there somewhere. I mean, I think that that's something that we can add to make it a little bit more of a guidance type document than it has been.
Christine Goldhawk, could I ask you from your district's perspective, what would be the take on all this?
I'm actually from the same district as Mary Hannah.
So you would have a similar perspective to hers.
I would have a similar perspective. I actually teach civics and law, so I'm at the high school level. I think standards would give us a little bit of, I guess, a safety blanket, if you will, because there is so much need for local control within New Canaan. But if we can point to those standards instead of having the frameworks, I think it'll help us when the questions come up. Well, why are you teaching this? Why are you teaching it this way? Having the standards will help kind of support what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Would you find folks predict that what we'll do will get public, no matter what it is? I'll rephrase that. I think no matter what we do, we're going to get a lot of public attention on this time around, probably more than we have in the past. Because I know some of your districts that you're in, I'm stunned that there's, Eileen, I'm stunned that Glastonbury is going through what you folks are going through. So,
a lot of haters out there.
Right.
It's a lot of haters. And I really, I mean, we're teaching social studies, we're persevering, but everything is under scrutiny. So in every district, everything is under scrutiny. So when I said it's a tough time to do standards, everyone's going to want to weigh in. Everybody is going to want to weigh in on what Tony, you mentioned, someone said, well, Abraham Lincoln's not in our current standards. We just had a parent do a word search for our strategic plan, and at a board meeting say the word equity is in here 30 times, but the word citizen is only in here once. So that's the kind of interesting scrutiny that everything that we do is going through. So it's just something to keep in mind as we begin work, that there's going to be a lot of people with diverse opinions who want to weigh in. So we're lucky, we're blessed that we live here, because there's so much we can do and say, but there's also, they're not getting the same press and they're not getting the same legislative support, but there is a huge number of people, very conservative, who want us to change our curriculum in a very different way than we're talking about.
Let's go to Teresa.
Hi, everyone. I just want to share that based on the reflection of yesterday's presenters and today's, they were like phenomenal. And just be mindful to, as we go through this process, that if there are biases that show up, that we balance that. I think that's where arguments start to really happen, is if people feel that somehow we're not being transparent and somehow there are these biases in there, because the frameworks don't present that way at all. And so I think that will help have the dialogue. And there were so many takeaways, like separating the person from some of the ideas. So let's process through the concerns that exist and make sure that biases aren't taking front center stage, and that we're really trying to be very respectful to sharing information and giving kids, the best possible education they can have.
One thing that Karen kind of put into the chat just a second ago that has me kind of thinking a little bit more deeply is about the really has to do with representation. How is it that we make sure that we have a representative sample, and not like representative like 80% or one group and 20% that matches what our population is, but a representative so that all voices are heard equally. I think that's going to be tricky as well. But thank you, Karen, for bringing up that point in terms of representation.
And Teresa, could you just tell folks if somebody didn't know what district you're from?
Region 12 is a very small rural district, Washington, Bridgewater, and Roxbury. And we really don't have, I do find families here really, really receptive. As you know, we've had the Blues and Beyond come to elementary level last year to talk about historical topics that can be uncomfortable, and they're very appreciative, and they trust us because we're not playing a game either. So I welcome questions and dialogue always with our constituents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that reminds us what the theme of this conference is, which is teaching social studies with courage. We're going to have to lead with courage as well. So with that, we're going to actually take a break for about 5 minutes. We're going to be back at 1:30 with a fantastic panel of educators that are going to be speaking directly to the theme of teaching social studies with courage. So we'll be back in 5.